Hi. I think you know everybody here. That's Erica. Did you know Erica? My sister? I know Tony Charlo walked in. Tony walked in. And I said, here, give me your
Bon, vas-y.
Il y a plein de bouteilles.
I know, I'm David Rose.
Je pense que tu vas
David,
Vas-y,
give me
put this one.
Put this one up. This one's
Ida.
from Italy.
That's me. Hi, Ida. Naomi.
Was?
Okay,
goodness.
but I'll taste it and then I'll get one after the tasting. Okay.
Are you serious?
By the way.
This is my husband, Jeffrey.
Hello.
Ida Tarlo. Jeffrey
Nice
Rother.
to meet you. Sorry about the cold hands.
I'm going to be 100 years old in a couple of days.
Fantastic.
Wow. Happy
Fantastic.
birthday.
How come you're not in Florida?
Where's that?
Warm country.
She's not a Florida person.
I'm from Russia.
Right.
I like
Okay.
cold.
I got you.
Well, that's what.
Я не понимаешь по-русски.
It means I don't understand Russian?
Я не понимаешь means I don't understand.
Right.
По-русски is Russian.
Right. So you don't understand, but you speak it very well.
I wouldn't exaggerate, but
До свидания.
до свидания.
Как поживаете?
Oh, yeah, you're good too, Erica.
Как тебе на русский?
It's so great to see you.
You don't know how great it is. Now we're working with Grassy Narrows, a First Nation community in Northern Ontario that was horribly exposed to mercury.
We see them now.
Nicely named the Professor Emeritus. I do what I am passionate about, which is research. So I continue. Right now I'm working with Grassy Narrows, a First Nation community, and enjoying it tremendously.
I was in the Maritime from 66 to 70. So all those events at that time I wasn't even aware of. So I come back to Montreal. I sublet from a significant person who was Jean-Marc Piot.
Jean-Marc Piot is a fairly well-known Quebec intellectual, a progressive.
Somehow he knew something was coming down, and he left. When they released him, of the 4,000 ever who was arrested, that he literally headed for the Ontario border.
What was this Mr. Piot being arrested for? Was for
1970, everybody was arrested.
Okay, Mesure d'Octobre. Did you know that, man?
The only
Jean-Marc Piot? No. Yeah,
That is the English-French divide that should not exist, particularly in the progressive community.
But one is, I wonder how many people were in the production of the Gilbert and Sullivan operetta
HMS Pinafore?
HMS
I was in
Pinafore.
it.
Yes.
So if I begin to sing,
Where is this? At Lakeview?
at the camp,
At Lakeview.
I am the captain of the Pinafore and a right good captain too. We're very, very good, and be it understood, I will a right good crew. He's very, very good, and be it understood, he commands our right good crew. So that's the thing that came rushing back to me.
What was the context of this? I can't remember.
It was our day camp,
Oh, Camp Kinderland? Lakeview.
Lakeview Camp.
Okay.
And for me, I think the thing I liked the most was the music programs, and doing the singing in the shows.
Did it have a political overtone? That
No, it didn't. We didn't do much Brecht. And
But we did sing a lot of.
we did sing folk songs.
A lot of lefty folk songs.
We know
If I had a hammer.
Yeah, we know that by heart.
This land is your land.
Other people have to learn it when they're 30.
What is the hammer?
If I
If I had a hammer, I'd hammer in the morning. I'd hammer in the evening all over this land. I'd hammer out danger. I'd hammer out warning. I'd hammer out trust between my brothers and my sisters all over this land.
Wasn't hammering for justice one of the?
I'd bring it in the morning. I'd bring it in the evening. All over this land. I'd bring out danger. All the same. I'd bring out warning. I'd bring out the love between my brothers and my sisters. All over this land. He never remembers anything, right? Or if he remembers it wrongly.
Excuse me, I have to get a glass of wine.
Somebody sit down beside him so it won't be just so red all over.
When we were growing up, my parents didn't want me to know about their communist background. So they were still paranoid, I think, about the McCarthy era. So they had taken away all the books, the really lefty books, on the bookshelves, like Das Kapital and the Communist Manifesto, and they were kind of put in some kind of closet somewhere.
Because Duplessis and the Loi du Cat now were coming to take them away.
But finally, this was like 1967.
In our house, they replaced them with Eros magazine.
Well, there you go. So finally, I'm about 13 years old, so this would have been like 66, 67. And suddenly I become interested in politics. And so I remember one night at dinner, and so Louis must have been like 16 or so, and I was like 13. And I say to my parents, I don't think communism is that bad. I think like there's some really good things about communism. And my parents go, oh yeah, that's interesting. Why don't you explain it? So I go, well, because, it's like people have rights and, it's like the workers really need to be and so I'm kind of going, and my parents are kind of smirking. And finally Louis says, you stupid idiot. He said, what do you think Mom and Dad have been doing all these years? And he says, look. I think they had taken out the books by this point and put them back on the shelves. And they said, look at the bookshelf. And I went, oh. And that's when I started asking my parents about everything, and that's when they told me. But I didn't know anything until then.
They were worried about, because we would go to New York often, and if we said something at the border, they wouldn't be allowed in to the United States.
So Mom kept her American citizenship. In the 60s, during the Vietnam War, she gave it up. But until then, she didn't.
But at the beginning, they didn't want to tell us because they didn't want us to spill the beans.
I think they were afraid of us
To
being
whom?
like the Rosenberg.
To anybody that would turn them in.
My father, he was born in New York. Yeah, he fought in New York State. He fought in the war after Russia joined. Anyway, that's another story. But he didn't have Canadian citizenship and he couldn't travel. They could go to Nassau, but they couldn't go anywhere that wasn't a British protectorate or whatever. So I remember a friend of his said, why don't you talk to your MP and get your Canadian citizenship? This is ridiculous, because it was already in the mid 60s. And Paul was volunteering. He wanted to work for the NDP party during the election. They didn't want him to say anything about it. Like, they were worried about him if it came out that he was doing work for the NDP, that my father might not be able to get his citizenship.
When did he get his citizenship?
It's interesting, like 69, 70, something like that. Very
I went to the Soviet Union
Sit down
to
here.
see if it's really what they said it was. And because I was stupid, I actually stopped people. I come from Russia. I did speak Russian, not fluently, but enough to a word here and a word there.
When did you go to the Soviet Union?
I was young and foolish.
I thought it was later, Ida.
Pardon?
I thought it was in the late 80s that you went to the Soviet Union.
About that, yeah.
Okay, so you were already not in the party anymore.
No,
That's it.
but I wanted to see what it was like, and I found that they followed me practically to the bathroom.
The KGB?
Pardon?
The KGB was following you?
Tina,
They-
that was because they thought you were so attractive.
Charming and attractive.
So what was your feeling about them, aside the fact that they were following
Frightened
you?
as all hell.
Frightened as all hell.
Yeah. I couldn't wait to get out.
We never, probably none of us, maybe some of us, but I never heard the story of what happened when the Stalin atrocities came out. Because I would have been 7 or something, right? 56?
Well, I have an incredible anecdote
So,
about that.
like, what happened? You guys must have just had meetings and just fallen apart with regret.
I'm going to
and-
tell you about that because I was old enough to remember. You come and hold the camera. I'm
Okay.
going to tell you.
And then we'll hear also from Ruth.
I think Ruth wants to say something.
We'll hear from Ruth too.
This, all right, and then Ruth will come. I was 5 or 6, and we were living on Dupree, that little stretch of street near the Y, the Jewish Y. And I was the type of person, and already at 6 or 7, I must have been 6 or something, because I was in grade 1.
Oh yeah.
And or Gilbert could do it if you can. And I was listening at the door of my bedroom. I shared a bedroom with my brother Mark, and I used to read. I used to hide under the covers and find a light. So I was always listening with my parents. So they had this meeting. There was like a sort of a breakfast nook, and they were all sitting there. I forget who was there, maybe Ida or Lou. I know that Sam Carr was in from Toronto, and I believe your dad was there, and I don't know if your mom was there, but there was a tight-knit group, and they were discussing, because Khrushchev had just slammed the shoe on the table and he'd revealed what had been going on in the camps, and including the huge number of Jews that had died in the what do they call it? The Gulag, all right, because a lot of the intellectuals, the writers who had been Jewish had been eliminated. And Khrushchev had been the one that had revealed the Stalin atrocities, and the party was breaking up. So a lot of people at the table, I mean, they were only a small, intimate group, were leaving the party, including my parents. And I remember Sam Carr was remaining loyal. He wasn't ready to throw in the towel. But I remember this as a young child, and I don't have that many memories, but I remember how dramatic it was, because I knew that my parents were in the party, because my mom worked for Fred Rose, right? And my dad used to do political tracts and trade union stuff.
But they didn't leave the same year. That's the thing that always fascinated me, is they left. She left a year later than he did because she was
with Sam.
and I always wondered how they negotiated that year.
But
I thought it
also
was
the Fred Rose, because they were eventually with Raymond Boyer. They were.
But that was earlier. Fred and Ray wasn't.
I thought it was
wasn't
all
that like
around the same
53?
time.
Yeah, I
That
thought
was
it was
53.
52, 51,
That's it.
52.
I was 7 years old then.
Okay, so
That
we
was
were really-
exactly
Wasn't
the same time.
56.
Sam Carr, to me, was the most intelligent person that you could possibly find. And when he quit the party, I actually fell apart. I had to go to a psychiatrist because I was out of my mind. I mean, the whole idea of communism is so incredibly good. And these people are all foul.
They were betrayed the ideals.
That's right. So, but Sam Carr, who was one of the party leaders, quit. So I knew that it wasn't just one person. It was how you saw things, whether you were really looked into anything or you just accepted whatever was told to you, which I did. And so it was almost much worse for me, I would say.
You felt like you're betrayed by the
Yes,
whole of the...
they all stayed at my house because I was the only rich person. And anything they wanted, anytime they wanted money, there was Ida there. So
With Lou behind her.
Lou was paying,
Lou was
picking up
paying
the
some of the
tab.
bills, I assume.
oh yeah.
So questions about the party and how the party really functioned and how things functioned in the Soviet Union go back a long time, way before the Khrushchev Papers. The Khrushchev Papers, I think, came out in February, maybe February 20th.
What year was that? 50, what was it?
Pardon?
What year was that? 56? No.
Yes, 56. There were questions from way back in the 30s that were being raised by intelligent people, saying that there were all kinds of things in the Soviet Union that were not as great as we thought it was. And we, the communists, thought that they were wrong. They were right. There were big, big debates. There were friendships that were broken because there were people who thought that we should be questioning a lot of the things that the Soviet Union was doing. But this was not what was done. It was like a church, and you really were part of the church, and you were loyal. And you thought that things would get better. And instead, things got much worse. Within the party executive, there were differences. There was one man who was J.B. Salzberg, and he differed with the rest of the party of members of the executive: Tim Buck, Sam Carr, Leslie Morris, John Boychuk, William Cashton, etc. He felt that the Soviet Union was not doing the right things, particularly towards the Jewish people. During the war, when we were friends with the Soviet Union, there was a delegation of Jewish writers who came to Canada and the United States. Their names were Michoels and Pfeffer. They were extremely well known, and they were part of the mobilizing effort to raise support for the Soviet Union. And so that was a very happy time. Within a few years after that, we didn't hear about them. They disappeared from the scene. Nobody heard about them. J.B. Salzberg was the person who raised the questions. Where are they? What is happening? We hear a lot about Jewish people being persecuted. We hear about a doctor's plot. There was a doctor's plot where it was apparently claimed that there were Jewish doctors who were trying to poison and kill Stalin, of course, which was phony. But on the basis of that, a lot of Jewish people were exterminated, amongst them Michoels and Pfeffer. It was so bad. J.B. Salzberg didn't leave the party, but he was a thorn in the side. And finally, when the papers came out, it was immediately raised. The question was raised, what are we going to do about this? Tim Buck's view was that it will be better. Things will improve. And many people in the leadership felt that we should send a delegation to the Soviet Union and have meetings with them and find out how are they going to deal with all this. The parties in different parts of the world, like the French party and the Italian party, quickly, not very slowly, but quickly, distanced themselves from the Soviet Union. The Canadian party did not. The Canadian party stands firm. In Quebec, the leadership here, amongst them Guy, felt that we have to distance ourselves. And so there were big, big arguments back and forth. And the leadership, some of those did stay at my house as well, not just at your house. Tim Buck didn't stay.
I think you mentioned that Tim did stay.
Tim as well stayed, but J.B. stayed many times.
Who's J.B.?
J.B. Salzberg. He taught Joe how to sing like a bird. His attitude is that we have to get to the bottom of it. So there were meetings ad nauseum. There was nobody leaving in a hurry, but the meetings kept on going back and forth. And it was known in the Party of Canada, but the Quebec Party was an important part. The Ontario Party was another part. The part in the West was mainly in the central part of the prairies, and they were staying close to the Soviet Union because there was a lot of Russians, Ukrainians, etc. Anyway, the battle went on with huge, huge meetings where we try to work things out, where we try to convince. Tim Buck went, and so did J.B. Salzberg went. We insisted on that. And they came back with different reports.
They went to the Soviet Union.
Just went to the Soviet Union and came back. Tim Buck said that things are going to be better. We just cannot throw the baby out with the bathwater, was his slogan. And J.B. Salzberg felt that it would not change. And finally, there was a meeting of the executive, the provincial executive, here in Quebec, where they drafted a letter. It was Guy, Harry Binder, Arnie Eisenman, Ken Perry, Norman Nierenberg, one more. I've lost somebody.
A lot of men, huh? There weren't too many women.
No women. Drafted a letter and said they're going to resign. And then they went around and gave the newspaper the press release to the press that night. So it was announced on October the 15th in 56 they resigned. There were phone calls at our house as if somebody had died. It was sympathy, anxiety. Where do we go now? What do you want us to do? And we couldn't give them an answer as to what to do. There was no answer. We're leaving. You want to follow? Do what you want. You want to stay? That's your problem. So there were broken, thanks you very much. There were broken friendships at that time because a lot of people just didn't want to leave. And they thought we were being unfaithful.
Eventually the party kind of dissolved. Did it completely, or there was...
A lot of people left.
This large group of people who were activists and engaged, was there a desire to form another party or to join an existing party and try to move them in the direction that they were interested in?
From where I sat, which is close to Guy, I think Guy was in such a state of depression he didn't know where to go. I think he was just too unsure about where it was going to go. As a matter of fact, that night, I tell Paul the story. He didn't want to come here, incidentally. And it's interesting, because I remember I went to speak to him because he was the eldest of the three boys, and I want him to know because he used to be aware that we were talking with the guys when they were at the house all the time. So I said, Dad is going to be leaving and at the job as a worker for the party tomorrow. And he said, I understand, that's what all the argument has been back and forth, right? And then the next thing he said, what's he going to do to earn a living then? And then the next thing he said was, I guess he's going to work for you, because I was running a small baby business. But he was so depressed that he was not even answering the telephone. He wouldn't give interviews. There was one phone call which I took, and then he did agree to take it. It was from Gérard Pelletier, who asked us to come for a discussion with him and Pierre Trudeau and...
Loads of people stayed with me in St. Dona.
Yes.
My house was so full that nobody bothered even to call anymore. They would come, they would bring blankets, sleep on the balcony. I would get up in the morning and find I had to make breakfast for 12 people. You know, and
all of them were card-carrying members, or some were hangers-on that were there for the food?
Some were hangers-on. Oh yeah. In fact, it reached a point where I could never make enough food. I was left, and that's another thing that really pissed me off, was that I was a woman. And we were treated in no better way than any other party. We were women. We weren't as intelligent as the men were. And I had a hard time with that, because at home my mother was very religious, and if you asked any question about God, it was bang, bang. You don't question God. And it reached a point where I felt, you don't question God, they're gods. All these people are gods. And because I was richer than most people there, I had work up to here. I was constantly catering to people. Nobody bothered washing dishes. That was not for them. So I cooked, I washed dishes, I made beds for them. My balcony was full. I'd get up in the morning and find people sleeping on my balcony. They hitchhiked up.
This was in St. Dona.
Yeah, it got me thinking a lot. I think all these things, instead of accepting it, that's part of a communism, openness, well, the only openness was on my part. I was doing the cooking.
Open door policy.
Yeah, and nobody bothered to help. I was doing the cooking and I was washing the dishes. And when they'd leave, I'd have the floor to wash and all these things.
I helped when I came.
And it yeah, well, the thing is that I have always been.
Do you remember I came up with my 3 kids?
Pardon?
Do you remember I came up with my 3 kids to spend about a week or two?
Yeah, well,
I helped.
this was Communists are supposed to be open.
I remember my mother in the kitchen with you all the time.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
I have a memory of St. Donat.
You have to come closer because you're too
Coming
far.
closer. I'll sit on Debbie's lap.
Come and sit here.
If you sit on Debbie's lap, you'll make her disappear.
I'll crush it. What I remember, and this must have been, well, this is a St. Donat memory, not necessarily a communism memory. I remember on Friday nights when the fathers would come up on Friday nights, and I remember because I was dumped on Ida all the time. She didn't seem to mind though. She was always happy to have a little girl around, and I remember sitting there outside, probably being completely devoured by mosquitoes, waiting to see the lights on the father's car. And I remember, I think Lou, I don't know, must have been 4 or 5. Lou had an orange car with fins on it. And I still remember that vision of the lights on the fins in the dark. The excitement when Lou and my father arrived.
Red lights, of course.
The red lights. And was it an orange car? Do you remember an orange car? It was orange, right?
Was this in the meadow?
No, this was at Ida's house.
Where was your place?
Her house was like, where the blooms and the where it was right over there. It was a beautiful house, and inside the house it was all. I don't know how I know this.
Windows.
It was BC fir.
Oh yeah.
Or cedar or something. BC fir. So it was dark and orange and beautiful inside.
So there was a lot of orange because there was the orange car, the orange in the house, and then the rock on the road that had the orange painted orange.
And
It would have been red, but they were trying to keep it sort of away from it.
it didn't have a skull.
NDP, yeah,
Didn't have a skull and crossbones on it. And there was to get back to red, there was a raspberry patch in front of Vita's house. I was telling her earlier I used to spend a lot of time in the raspberry patch, lying on my back and just shoving raspberries in my mouth until I got the worst case of hives you can imagine. And then I wasn't allowed to hang out in the raspberry patch.
Now I know why you never come over to pick raspberries when I invite you.
So those are my memories. But Ruth has more to say.
From my recollection, it was basically like almost every Jew left the party. Is that correct? In '56?
Some hung around.
Yeah.
Yeah, real old timers hung around for a long time.
Right, but the vast majority left. And that
Slowly.
was like a good percentage of the membership, right?
Yeah, slowly. They didn't
All our
come.
parents?
They didn't arrive. They didn't leave it quickly because they were shattered.
Right.
Yeah. I think that Guy was depressed, and I think it was too bad because there had been all kinds of overtures. First of all, the third person at that evening was Pierre Trudeau.
With what?
You
Pierre
said
Trudeau.
Trudeau. Who were the three?
Marchand.
Trudeau?
Pelletier.
Marchand.
Oh, Marchand was the Marchand.
Was Trudeau actually in the party or just a sympathizer?
No, he wasn't in the party at all.
Trudeau wasn't in the party.
No.
He was a sympathizer.
So what
He
was
was
the connection?
he was a progressive left-wing person.
So were
And-
they trying to get Guy to join whatever they
No.
were doing?
Years before that, before when we were still active in the party, Pierre Trudeau had a little gathering every, whatever period it was, every couple of weeks in, I think it was in Morne Heights, where it was called I had the name in my head just a minute ago, a gathering of the smart people. And what they try to do is invite people to come and speak about their outlook on things. And it was really, I'll find the name because it's an interesting one. So they invited Guy to come up even when he was in the party to speak about why he was in the party and what about it. What about communism, what about socialism, etc. Because Pierre was a very open guy. He had gone to China, he'd gone to Cuba, so he wasn't exactly a stranger to left-wing thought. And so there was discussion back and forth. But when they were there, they were discussing that night. To me, it seems to me in retrospect, and I thought so even then, that they were making overtures of what are you going to do now? Because they thought he was a smart guy and good in politics. Why are you just going to step aside when you have all that experience? And where are you going to go? But Guy was not in the mood to do anything like that.
And what about all the other families, like our parents? Did they just decide to step up? Were they also the
Yes,
sort of kind of
they did.
depression? They said they're just going to step away from social.
The people who were very close friends of ours,
Yeah.
that included your parents, the Berkowitzes too.
I think that
The
when
problem-
listening to you, when I think about my parents, I think my father had already had a huge loss in his life because he was raised as an Orthodox Jew, and that was a huge traumatic thing for him when he left that. So I think this was just the same thing all over again,
Yeah.
but with a slight difference.
I didn't know that about your father.
Well, his dad was a Hasidic Jew.
Some of the people decided they were going to just settle in and become capitalists quickly.
It wasn't, they didn't name it that way, did they? Or
No, they wanted to make a bit of
Yes,
money and
like
have a good life for
Ken
their
Perry
kids.
came to me.
They didn't want Ida to be the only
No, it was
rich
Norman
one.
Nuremberg came to me.
Well, I actually went to the Soviet Union, and that was my first eye-opener, because I was followed everywhere, practically into the bathroom. I felt very ill at ease and very uncomfortable is the understatement. I felt that there was somebody on my back constantly. No matter where I went, if I looked up, there was somebody looking at me that I didn't know. You could feel it, you feel these things. I came home and I immediately phoned Sam Carr to tell him that I was not very happy with what I saw. And he said, "Oh, Ida, remember, they just begun the first party. Of course they make mistakes. Some mistakes, boy. They put you in jail if you talk the way I'm talking right now." So there was no such a thing. I come from a very religious family. And if I would say to my mother, "Why does God?" I never got beyond God. It was bang, bang. You don't question God. Well, this was another God. And when I came back and discussed it with Tim, he said, "Ida, you said you feel it, but obviously you came there with a negative feeling. Ergo, you come back with a negative feeling."
Memories of Saint Dona and my mother singing at all the parties and the
Oh yeah,
picnics
with her guitar.
with her guitar, yeah. And
Your mother went
she
on a
was
trans-Canada trip.
She did. My mother went on a trip with a group called the Travelers, I think.
Really?
Oh.
They're well known.
And she went away for 6 weeks.
So you remember your mom as a wonderful guitarist and a
As
singer?
a wonderful guitarist and a singer, and the song that everybody wanted my mother to play was "Blood on the Saddle."
What is that?
There was blood on the saddle and blood on the ground and a great big puddle of blood all around. Yeah, that was always
a significant song.
That's right. Everybody loved
Why
that
was
song.
it so
It was
significant?
red.
Red. There you go.
And it was maybe a symbol of things to come when the party
right.
started
I think
bloodletting.
it was the kids who liked that.
So we had the directors of the camp they were all musical. I think Esther Bosky did she
Right.
play the guitar or sing?
Yes.
And Tassie Singerman took over, and of course
Nat
as
Levine.
your
Another
mother-
part of the staff?
And Nat
Did she volunteer?
Steinberg.
And there was a story talking about the communists that my parents told me that I didn't know. There was some tip-off that an inspector was coming to check the books in St. Dona in the meadow. And the Krelnstons lived opposite us, Abe and Dorothy.
Right.
And the story was that suddenly there was smoke coming out of their chimney on a hot summer July day. Book burning.
They burnt their own books before the people came to
that's
take them.
right. Yeah, that's right.
Do you remember any of the names of those books that were
I have
No.
a bunch here.
No,
Howard Fast?
No, no clue.
And what's his name?
Sacco and Vincent.
The guy that wrote Bethune.
Gilbert found a card in one of these books the other day that said,
Hold it up.
"It's a girl." When Eric was born, it was a card my aunt had sent. It was stuck in one of these books.
That is a book about Lenin?
I tried to give them to McGill Rare Books, but they
didn't
seem
want?
interested. I think they have a few copies.
I love the when the dads used to come on Friday night, and I used to stand at the road, yeah.
I wasn't allowed.
And then the dads would play volleyball on Saturday morning.
Yeah.
Remember
I
that?
remember that. My father would always get a sprained ankle every Saturday.
Yeah.
And then there was a famous time when my father fell asleep coming up on a Friday evening.
At the wheel?
Yeah, he fell asleep at the wheel and had a crash.
Oh, no.
And he almost died. Yeah. Yeah.
I remember my father bribing a policeman because he was going too fast.
And does everybody remember that that we used to drive up on the road called the Monstrosity?
Yes.
Yeah.
I remember that.
Was pink.
It was
orange,
painted
and
purple. It was mauve at some point.
On the left-hand side of the
That's
road
where we
going
did
in.
art.
And I used to throw up all the time in the car
Yeah.
because the roads were so bad, and my
bumpy.
parents used to explain it was because of Duplessis. Because he made me throw up. If the town hadn't voted for Duplessis, the roads didn't get paved, so you drove on gravel, and that's what made me throw up. That's my pleasant
Between
story.
St. Agatha and St. Donat was paved.
Every election year, they pave a little more.
I used to take the old road, 17.
Yeah,
That's right.
Yeah, on one
Used to remember
Rodden.
Jesus on the cross at one of the.
18.
And I used to have to take gravel for that trip.
Gravel on
Before
the
we started
gravel.
going via St. Agatha.
There was a song about that road.
Okay.
On the way to Saint Donat, where your kishkas swing and sway. And you have to hold your stomach every inch along the way.
Sing it again because he unplugged me while you were singing it. One more time.
Tony can see it. On the way to Saint Donat, where your kishkas swing and sway, and you have to pump your stomach every inch along the way. And for those who seek attention, there's another primrose path. You reach out. Can't remember.
Susie, a story?
Well, a couple of things. One, I did want to say about If I Had a Hammer. That was the Peter, Paul, and Mary version. We sang a slightly different tune. I certainly remember learning last night I had the strangest dream.
Oh, yeah.
I still sing that.
And little boxes. Remember little boxes?
What I also remember is I happened to have been with my mother, probably my brother too, but I remember my mother at Ida's house when we heard on the radio that Duplessis died.
That's what I was going to ask.
And
you.
I can
Remember that night?
picture my mother and Ida dancing.
I remember that night very clearly. My father's office needing help. And he helped everybody. And there was even one person who ended up in our house at 4 o'clock in the morning who had tried to put a bomb somewhere and blew himself up. And he came in, my father's holding his intestines. And well, my father got him to a doctor and he
Do you remember
okay.
all this from personally, or?
Yeah, I mean, this was, there are a lot of memories. But my memories that are similar to about not saying things is, I remember when we were in school, it must have been about first or second grade, and we had to read the story about the good Madame Chiang Kai-shek. And I knew two things. One, that it wasn't true.
What?
It wasn't true.
Oh, yeah.
Because my bedtime stories had been about Mao Zedong and how he escaped from Chiang Kai-shek's forces. But the other thing I knew, that I should not say it. And I don't know how, and maybe some of you know. How did I know that? I knew not to say anything in school that...
I remember the first time I was in my 20s, I think. I have a good friend who's from Czechoslovakia, from the former Czechoslovakia, and her husband. And we were in a restaurant in Old Montreal, and I started talking about my parents' left-wing activities. And here I was in my 20s saying it out loud and I mean, the whole restaurant couldn't hear me, just my friends at the table. But I remember it was the first time I'd actually talked about it with anybody in public. I think our parents must have told us very young not to talk about it. I think we just knew. I mean, I think, was it Richard who talked about crossing the border? Who talked about
I did, yeah.
and when our parents drove us across the border, my father would drive to Phillipsburg, and we never had any fruit in the car because my mother explained you could get stopped for having fruit in the car, so that was a big thing. And at the border, just like a few miles before the border, they would get out and she would drive and he would sit in the passenger seat because he was blacklisted and she wasn't, or we never knew whether she was. So she was always the one to drive across the border, and we were told to keep our mouths firmly shut.
I remember that too.
Well, I remember not keeping my mouth shut, and Susie Bloom is in this story. It wasn't actually communist, but it was in kindergarten. Well, it was kindergarten or grade 1. It was a huge event in my life, probably not so much in yours. But somehow in class, you know, we were all in the Protestant school board. Like, I know more Christmas carols than any of my Catholic friends.
Protestant,
yeah. But Lord's Prayer. So that morning, for some reason, the question came to me, you know, what prayer do you say, you know, before you go to bed? Or like, you know, what's your, because they knew I was Jewish or something like that. What's your spiel? And I said, well, I don't believe in God. And then, which of course meant my parents don't believe in God. And then the whole class went, oh! Like that, and Susie was sitting there, and I was just glaring at her because she didn't say anything. And I knew Susie didn't believe in God either. And then
way to go,
the
Susie.
teacher was so flustered, and the teacher said, "It's okay. All you have to do," and she gave me a little prayer to say every night before I went. That'll convert you. Which I didn't do, but it was very.
How old were you then?
5 probably.
Oh, really? Little?
Yeah, because it was kindergarten or grade 1. So I didn't know I wasn't supposed to say that.
Do you remember they used to send this form home, and your parents had to fill in your name, your age, and your religion.
Yeah.
And my father wrote none, of course.
Oh.
and I had to take that into school.
Whoa.
That was very bad.
It was better than writing communist.
Susie's going to say
as a rebuttal. Religion played no place in my house, so I probably didn't even think about God. So that's the only thing I can think of. But I wanted to say something about the cross-border thing because the only time we went to the States that I can remember when I was young, we drove. And after that, if we went anywhere on vacation, it was to the Bahamas or whatever. My aunt and uncle went to Florida. No, we don't go to Florida. And my parents, like most parents here, never talked about being members of the party. It was just not a discussion. I knew they were left wing, but we didn't talk about it. My mother got quite sick in 1966, and they couldn't figure out what it was, and they finally suggested that she go to the Mayo Clinic. And my father flew down with her, and he was stopped. He was stopped, and they finally said, okay, you can go for a day, but then you have to leave. And he left, and my aunt flew down to be with my mother. He eventually had to get a lawyer to
My father did that too, and it was during Reagan, when Reagan was in power. And my father, of course, was not a big Reaganite. And it killed him that he had to write a letter of apology. What's his first name? Mimberger's husband?
Yeah, he was the
Mike Berger. He was the lawyer. And I guess your father did the same thing. They had to write letters of apology to the United States government.
I don't know what he had to do because my father didn't say anything.
Okay, my father talked about it, and it was very painful for him writing that letter. He just hated writing.
Do you remember when
What
the
I
lights were turned
remember
back?
What I remember most is that I was always left with the dishes.
But that had nothing to do with getting to the United States. You didn't have to take the dishes with you to the U.S.
I wonder if Joe remembers.
That's
Does Joe
all.
remember if
They
I
would
said not
come.
to mention it?
What?
Do you have any recall? Did we ever discuss with you not to mention left-wing politics or anything?
I'm waiting to intervene on that
Yeah,
subject. Two stories. One is about, I guess, the composition of the party. It wasn't only Jews.
No.
It was about half, I think.
Oh, just
Yeah, or maybe a little bit more, but I know that Ruth mentioned that the first exposition of the stories about the acts directed in the Soviet Union by Stalin came in February '56. And the big exodus from the party in Quebec, in Canada, happened in October. And from February to June, there was a lot of debate in the party. And I know that during that period, let's go back a few years, in '48, the party in Quebec had actually expelled a whole group of people that were directed by Henri Gagnon. I don't know the exact parameters of the struggle that he was leading, but I believe it was about a number of people who were squatting. And there were issues about housing in Quebec at that point. But it was not the major issue for the party. And so it was like a question of autonomous direction of movements, and it was also somehow related to language issues. And they got expelled from the party. And in the February to June period of '56, where there were these issues that were being raised about all the discrimination against certain subpopulations. There was this question of the minority question and the Jewish question, but it was also national questions in the Soviet Union at that time that were exposed in the stories talked about by Khrushchev in the report, and one thing that had to be fixed before October '56 happened was to bring Henri Gagnon back into the party. And that I don't know. But that's part of the story which I picked up doing a little bit of research to try and understand what was going on in '56. And so there were the Jews, but there was also the national question. And it's interesting today because in the next election with the ON and QS fusing and the issues of We Quebec, and is there going to be some sort of alliance or not? And the idea of having a socialist, a left-wing party versus what's the position of the national question, still in that context. I find it mind-boggling that still is a question which is informing political questions in Quebec and was a major issue that had to be resolved. And Henri Gagnon was brought back into the party during the summer of '56, and then the October letter came out, which was described before, and then there was a massive exodus of the party.
Is that your perception that the Francophones, the Jews left before the Francophones?
No, the Francophones were reintegrated into the party, and then there was a
mass exodus. First of all, the Jews.
But it wasn't only the Jews. I mean, it was the issues that a number of people have brought up about not speaking about this is like, firstly, a funny one. Firstly, a funny story, because I'm not sure that I'm not conflating two stories, but my memory is we were going on vacation in 1958, holiday period. So, and I'm 8. No, 58, yeah, I'm 8. Yeah. And we're arriving at the border, I guess it was the 1st of January 1959, because we're arriving, we're going towards the border, and we've always known that when we get to the border, you shut up. You just don't talk.
Something we all
There's no question about making jokes. You don't make jokes with a border person. That is just like, no. But more than that, you don't talk because there has to be control on the message which is given. A, in the substance, and B, in the manner of delivery, so as to not get the person to open the black book which is on the counter there.
Right.
You know, you've all seen the black book right there. Okay, and if they open it, then for sure your father's name is in it, and we're not going on vacation. So, you be careful. And I might conflate the dates, but it seems to me that it was that date that happened, that we're going that way. And it's January 1, 1959, towards the end of the day, and there's a very happy event. There's Fidel Castro, who just arrived in power in Cuba. And it's like, but when you get to the border, shut up. And I don't know where that came from, but to me it's like crystal clear that from like a very, very early age, you don't talk about that. And I remember one instance was like about in 2nd grade or 4th grade, because I skipped 3rd. So it was 2nd or 4th, there was some thing about somebody posed a question in school about religion, and the answer at home was, what? Don't answer it. Just skirt the issue. Don't. It's just easier that way. And then there's this, border crossing, which is really clear. It was always like that. It was always like that, and for me, it's been like that all my life. That's
story I have to add to that, just to show how things change with the generation. I was traveling with my kids going from France to England, and we took the ferry across to Dover, and we arrived in Dover, and the man asked us our name, and he's got a book. And my sons said, sometimes it's under V and sometimes it's under G. For Van Gelder. He was trying to help. I said, Danny.
Shut up. You weren't in the book? You weren't in the book under V or G?
I got stopped once coming from back from Mexico, and my father was S. Pomerantz, and I actually saw the name in the book. This has been many years.
Well, I once went across the border.
Yeah, they were questioning me. But
What about you guys? Because your parents were Americans. Could you have problem going
My
back?
mother was American. My father wasn't American.
I thought both of them were.
No,
They met in the States.
They met in the States at Russian War Relief.
Yeah.
But no. So, but we knew that we weren't supposed to talk. And I remember once, very courageously, when I was quite young, Dad tried to explain to me what the difference between socialism and communism was. So then I would sort of get out of my mind this idea about communism, because socialism was possible. If something would slip out, you could say you were a socialist. And I remember this was a prolonged conversation over a week, and he was never satisfied with the way I was probably 6. Is that well, it was for these border crossings, because we would go like twice a year at least
to be the central thing
to
of
New
our
York.
family. Erica.
You know something? I don't remember my childhood, believe it or not. People ask me things I don't remember. I don't know why, but I don't.
Did your parents talk to you about being in the party at all?
I don't really remember. I knew later on. But no, I don't remember discussion. I do remember though when we were crossing the border once and we were stopped. We had to go back.
Oh, really?
Yeah, we were stopped once.
I remember going to Old Orchard with you guys. I think I was 3 or 4, so that was in 51. How did that happen? How did they cross the border?
I know. I must have been older than.
Were they parents
because
were able to cross the border? Were they blacklisted?
I don't think they were. I mean, we did get across, but there was one time I remember we were turned back. No.
I remember we harbored people on the run because we were a kind of low-profile family.
That's a good way of getting
In the 60s.
And I don't know if you remember that, but in Ville-Saint-Laurent, I think it was more than once that we had people staying in the basement and we weren't in the downstairs den. and we weren't supposed to mention it at all.
Well, part of the
And there were
family
people-
mythology was that Fred Rose came to
Yes, I think.
Mom and Dad's apartment in Ottawa when they were
Oh.
living in Ottawa, and just the night he was arrested, and said, "I need to make some phone calls, but I was never here."
Oh, boy.
Yeah, and then he was arrested that night.
And then there was twice, I think,
What-
a
what I
week-long
remember-
period when somebody was living with us and we weren't supposed to
Right.
talk about it at all.
Yeah.
And I really didn't know what it was about, and it was just totally mysterious.
I wanted to say about.
And they talked in Yiddish when they talked in
That's right. Right. Yeah. So we wouldn't understand. But I wanted to say what was really fascinating. What Joe was saying about nationalism and stuff, of how, like, in the old party line, nationalism meant right wing.
Of course.
Right? So that anything that was nationalistic became right wing. And then I think it was hard for my father, especially, as a Anglo-Jewish Montrealer who never spoke French, the idea of Quebec sovereignty was actually a right-wing concept. As opposed to...
Duplessis was a right-wing nationalist.
Yeah,
that's why.
but René Lévesque wasn't.
No, but then people had a difficulty making the switch. People who had lived
That's
through
right.
the period of Adrien Arcan and
Right.
Achat chez nous.
That's right.
So
And I would have big arguments with my dad, saying that Lévesque was a left wing. He was left wing, and that this was a progressive movement, and that a nationalist movement wasn't necessarily right wing. And this was something that he just didn't get.
My mother voted PQ in '76.
Yeah.
She was enthralled with them. She
Wow.
thought it was, these are, it's a socialist group. They'll do wonderful things. Boy, did she become disillusioned.
Oh, yeah.
Well, there was a
There was a-
coalition of
Yeah.
right and left wing
Well,
independentists.
as it turned out.
I remember everybody coming to my house in the country in St. Donat.
in the first year.
I remember even finding people in the morning, finding them asleep on the balcony.
were they Parti Québécois?
And
One is about, I guess, the composition of the party. It wasn't only Jews.
No.
It was about half, I think.
Oh, just
Yeah,
that.
or maybe a little bit more, but I know that Ruth mentioned that the first exposition of the stories about the acts directed in the Soviet Union by Stalin came in February '56. And the big exodus from the party in Quebec, in Canada, happened in October. And from February to June, there was a lot of debate in the party. And I know that during that period, let's go back a few years, in '48, the party in Quebec had actually expelled a whole group of people that were directed by Henri Gagnon, who were, pardon? Henri Gagnon.
Can you hear, Ruth?
Yes.
And he was directing I don't know the exact parameters of the struggle that he was leading, but I believe it was about a number of people who were squatting. And there were issues about housing in Quebec at that point. But it was not the major issue for the party. And so it was like a question of autonomous direction of movements, and it was also somehow related to language issues. And they got expelled from the party. And in the February to June period of '56, where there were these issues that were being raised about all the discrimination against certain subpopulations, there was this question of the minority question and the Jewish question, but it was also national questions in the Soviet Union at that time that were exposed in the stories talked about by Khrushchev in the report, and one thing that had to be fixed before October '56 happened was to bring Henri Gagnon back into the party. And that I don't know. but that's part of the story which I picked up doing a little bit of research to try and understand what was going on in '56. And so there were the Jews, but there was also the national question. And it's interesting today because in the next election with the ON and QS fusing and the issues of We Quebec, and is there going to be some sort of alliance or not? And the idea of having a socialist, a left-wing party versus what's the position of the national question, still in that context. I find it mind-boggling that still is a question which is informing political questions in Quebec and was a major issue that had to be resolved. And Henri Gagnon was brought back into the party during the summer of '56, and then the October letter came out, which was described before, and then there was a massive exodus of the party.
Stay in? Is that your perception that the Francophones, the Jews left before the Francophones?
No, the Francophones were reintegrated into the party, and then there was a
mass exodus. First of all, the Jews.
But it wasn't only the Jews. I mean, it was.
But again, like with my father. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Story I want to bring back because the issues that a number of people have brought up about not speaking about this is like, firstly, a funny one. Firstly, a funny story, because I'm not sure that I've got I'm not conflating two stories, but my memory is we were going on vacation in 1958, holiday period. So, and I'm 8. No, 58, I'm 8. Yeah. And we're arriving at the border, I guess it was the 1st of January 1959, because we're arriving, we're going towards the border. And we've always known that when we get to the border, you shut up. You just don't talk.
Something we all
There's no question about making jokes. You don't make jokes with a border person. That is just like, no. But more than that, you don't talk because there has to be control on the message which is given. A, in the substance, and B, in the manner of delivery, so as to not get the person to open the black book which is on the counter there. Right. You know, you've all seen the black book right there. Okay, and if they open it, then for sure your father's name is in it, and we're not going on vacation. So, you be careful. And I might conflate the dates, but it seems to me that it was that date that happened, that we're going that way. And it's January 1, 1959, towards the end of the day, and there's a very happy event. There's Fidel Castro, who just arrived in power in Cuba. And it's like, but when you get to the border, shut up. And I don't know where that came from, but to me it's like crystal clear that from like a very, very early age, you don't talk about that. And I remember one instance was like about in 2nd grade or 4th grade, because I skipped 3rd. So it was 2nd or 4th, there was some thing about, somebody posed a question in school about religion, and the answer at home was, what? Don't answer it, just skirt the issue. Don't it's just easier that way. And then there's this, border crossing, which is really clear. It was always like that. It was always like that, and for me, it's been like that all my life. That's
story I have to add to that, just to show how things change with the generation. I was traveling with my kids going from France to England, and we took the ferry across to Dover, and we arrived in Dover, and the man asked us our name, and he's got a book, and my sons said, sometimes it's under V and sometimes it's under G. For Van Gelder. He was trying to help. I said, Danny.
Just shut up.
You don't want to be in that book.
You weren't in the book? You weren't in the book under V or G?
I got struck once coming from back to Mexico. What I can remember from the St. Dona.
It was the dishes.
And my father was S. Pomerantz, and I actually saw the name in the book. This is many years
Well, I
They didn't
once
put the
went
two and two
across
together?
the border when
Yeah,
I
they were
was-
questioning me. But I
What
was
about you
female.
guys? Because your parents were Americans. Could you have problem going
My
back?
mother was American. My father wasn't
I
American.
thought both of them were.
No,
They met in the States.
They met in the States at Russian War relief.
Yeah.
But no. So, but we knew that we weren't supposed to talk. And I remember once, very courageously, when I was quite young, Dad tried to explain to me what the difference between socialism and communism was. So that I would sort of get out of my mind this idea about communism, because socialism was possible. You know, if something would slip out, you could say you were a socialist. And I remember this was a prolonged conversation over a week, and he was never satisfied with the way I was probably 6 or something. Well, it was for these border crossings, because we would go like twice a year at least
To be the central
to
thing of
New
our
York,
family.
you know.
Erica.
Yeah?
No, I don't, you know something? I don't remember my childhood, believe it or not. People ask me things, I don't remember. I don't know why, but I don't.
Did your parents talk to you about being in the party at all?
I don't really remember. I knew later on. I mean, but no, I don't remember discussion. I do remember though when we were crossing the border once and we were stopped. We had to go back.
Oh, really?
Yeah, we were stopped once.
I remember going to Old Orchard with you guys.
Yeah, I don't
So you
remember
must
that.
have, and that was, I think I was 3 or 4. So that was in 50, 51. How did that happen? How did they cross the border?
I know. I must have been older than
With
three
the
or
parents
four,
cross-
'cause
were your
I
parents able to cross the border? Were they blacklisted?
I don't think they were. I mean, we did get across, but there was one time I remember we were turned back. No.
I remember
once
we
went across with
harbored
false identity.
people on the
It was
run, because we
completely
were a kind
crazy.
of low-profile family.
That's a good way of getting
In the
trouble.
60s.
And I don't know if you remember that, but in Ville Saint Laurent, I think it was more than once that we had people staying in the basement, and we weren't in the downstairs den, and we weren't supposed to mention it at all.
Well, part of the
And there were
family
people-
mythology was that Fred Rose came to
Yes, I
Mom and Dad's apartment in Ottawa when they were
Oh.
living in Ottawa, and just the night he was arrested, and said, "I need to make some phone calls, but I was never here."
Oh, boy.
Yeah, and then he was arrested that night.
And then there was twice, I think,
What-
a
what I
week-long
remember-
period when somebody was living with us, and we weren't supposed to
Right.
talk about it at all.
Yeah.
And I really didn't know what it was about, and it was just totally mysterious.
I wanted to say about.
And they talked in Yiddish when they talked about
That's right. Right. Yeah. So we wouldn't understand. But I wanted to say what was really fascinating. What Joe was saying about nationalism and stuff, of how, like, in the old party line, nationalism meant right wing.
Of course.
Right? So that anything that was nationalistic became right wing. And then I think was hard for my father, especially, as a Anglo-Jewish Montrealer who never spoke French. The idea of Quebec sovereignty was actually a right-wing concept. As opposed to...
Duplessis was a right-wing nationalist.
Yeah,
that's why.
but René Lévesque wasn't.
No, but then people had a difficulty making the switch. People who had lived
That's
through
right.
the period of Adrien Arcan and
Right.
Achat chez nous.
That's right.
So
And I would have big arguments with my dad saying that Lévesque was a left wing. He was left wing, and that this was a progressive movement, and that a nationalist movement wasn't necessarily right wing. And this was something that he just didn't get.
My mother voted PQ in '76.
Yeah.
She was enthralled with them. She
Wow.
thought it was, these are a socialist group. They'll do wonderful things. Boy, did she become disillusioned.
Oh, yeah.
Well, there was a
There was a-
coalition
Yeah.
of right and left wing.
Well,
Independentists.
as it turned out.
I remember everybody coming to my house in the country in St.
Things
Donat.
in the first year.
I remember even finding people in the morning, finding them asleep on the balcony.
were they Parti Québécois?
Yeah.